Hello everyone, this is Mr. Owen. We are going to be exploring a Ancient Egypt Discovery Tour today. This is a game developed by Ubisoft, a part of a very familiar video game franchise which some of you might be familiar with. This version, though, is designed specifically for educational purposes, where you remove all the combat and violence aspects of the game, and it gets turned into basically a living, breathing digital museum where you can go and explore what life was like in ancient societies such as Egypt and Greece. So let's go ahead and get started with our agriculture and trade tour.
Welcome to Agriculture and Seasons.
So we are presently exploring the floodplain and fields of the ancient Nile Delta.
While crops were cultivated in different oases around the desert, most of the arable lands were near the Nile. Two types of cereal grain were cultivated, barley and an ancient wheat known as emmer. These two key ingredients contributed in establishing bread and beer as the staple of the Egyptian diet and the basis of its economy.
So we talked before about the importance of the Nile. The Egyptians would trade in papyrus and linen, but their main export was wheat and grains, and this was all because of the gifts of the Nile.
The Ptolemaic era created an agricultural revolution with the introduction of advanced agricultural techniques and new grain types such as rice, durum wheat, and pearl millet. The resulting agricultural mass production greatly increased the economy of ancient Egypt. It also prompted the development of storage and transportation, allowing long-distance trade with other regions.
As you can see here, these are the ancient equivalent of grain elevators, like we have so many of today in Kansas. And so they would establish trade with other regions such as Kush and Nubia to the south, and then eventually in the later kingdoms with the empires of Alexander the Great and the Roman Empire. And throughout history, Egypt has been a huge producer of grains, and specifically wheat, for a lot of ancient cultures. So we're going to take a trip through one of the fields here, see some grazing livestock within as well. So all of this would not be possible without the annual floodings of the Nile putting nutrients back into the soil.
Both bread and beer rations were part of a system of barter payment. The state used those goods to pay wages for those who worked in the quarries and at the construction sites. Beer was so important to ancient Egyptians, they had a goddess of beer brewing, Tenenet. Tenenet is seen in many paintings and sculptures with beer, and women are depicted as the primary beer makers.
So the grains they produce not only for bread and other uses, but beer as well. Because you imagine toiling under the hot sun, either in the fields or quarries or building pyramids, you need those extra calories and carbs to produce.
In order to increase agricultural production, fertile land was divided into plots and large agricultural villages were encouraged. The state and temples were the biggest landowners. Depending on the region, fertile land was managed by civil servants or rented to individuals. Ancient Egyptians relied on rudimentary tools for land cultivation. Soil was broken down with hoes, and wing plows were used to make furrows.
You see some of the living conditions there, right next to the fields and the river for the Egyptians. And look at these good boys right here, just hanging out with their owners. So we're going to head down to the edge of the Nile itself. You can see the many irrigation channels that have been cut into the land to get the water up to the fields. We're going to go off the beaten path for a second. This is a great moment to show one of the ancient Egyptian ships. And so these, like we talked about in the DBQ, were often used for transportation of goods between parts of the Egyptian kingdom and also to other lands. So they could load up grains or linen or papyrus and ship it to the south, upriver, to the kingdoms of Nubia and Kush, or later on, once they had established trade with Greece and Rome, they could send it to the north, downriver, into the Mediterranean Sea, where it could go to those two kingdoms. So this you can see here, wooden ship. Obviously, Egypt didn't have a lot of natural timber and wood for itself, so they had to trade with their neighbors. And one of the main things that they needed to get from them was lumber in order to build these ships. And so they would trade their grains, their papyrus, and their linens for stuff such as timber and then other more precious materials, which we'll talk about in a second. Let's get back to the tour. You can see the reeds I'm running through here. That's what they would use to make the papyrus.
The three seasons known as Akhet, Peret, and Shemu corresponded to a specific phase of the agricultural process and the river's natural changes. Akhet was the time of the flood, beginning with the appearance of the star Sirius in July. Peret was the time when lands were cultivated, plowed, and sown. This fell between October and November. Shemu ran from May to September and was when harvesting and taxation began.
So again, this refers back to the DBQ that we went through this cycle and the seasons of the flooding and how it determined what they were doing for their own jobs at that time. You can see this barge that we had just stopped at is now departed and is heading south or upriver against the flow of the river, likely to the kingdoms of Nubia and Kush. So the Egyptians would trade with their southern neighbors along the Nile for things such as ivory and ebony, and most specifically gold, because that was something that the wealthy and the pharaohs within Egypt definitely desired, was these fine items for making jewelry, ornamental decorations, and then of course all the gold that would decorate the tombs of the pharaohs and all the religious uses that it saw. So they didn't have those things naturally, so they needed to trade with them to obtain them. And so they would trade all their grains and other resources for those rare things that they could use. And looks like that barge is departing, heading that way, probably with some grains laid on it in order to do some exchanges. So you can see along here all these little storage facilities right next to the river, just because they needed to get all their goods for transport ready to get picked up by ships. So these are warehouses, essentially, along the river, where they are being prepared to be traded with other kingdoms. Again, passing through reeds and parts of irrigation.
The pharaoh's duty was to uphold order against chaos and provide for his people. Priests and local governors also wanted to appear as protectors of the people. However, any variation in the Nile's seasons could cause water shortages. This had devastating consequences on wheat and barley crops. The pharaoh, administrators, and priests knew they needed to demonstrate their ability to prevent such a catastrophe from happening. And so they invented the story, which would be inscribed upon the famine stela.
So also in our DBQ, we discussed at length how religion was very closely tied to the Nile, and how the flooding cycles and all that the Nile gave to the Egyptian people found its way into their religious beliefs and practices as well. And this is one of those stories.
The story begins with the pharaoh worried for his people. The Nile hasn't flooded in years, and his people are starving. In search of the origins of the flooding, Djoser seeks out Khnum, the protector god of the region and the source of the drought. Djoser gives the god offerings and orders his priests to restore the temple of Khnum. These offerings please the god, and the floods are restored. This story was intended to highlight the importance of the deity in everyone's daily lives, while also demonstrating the crucial role that the priests and the king played in feeding and protecting the people of Egypt.
So the Nile is central to everything in their life, from their trade to how they feed themselves to how they conduct their daily lives, all the way to their religion. And it is also their superhighway, how they get from place to place. Because if we take to the air for a second here, you can see, kind of like in the map we looked at in that very first day of the DBQ, everything around the Nile, beyond it, very unlivable, very hard to travel through. And then looking back the other directions, very similar story. So you have the only greenery here that is right along the Nile, and it's also the only easy way to get from place to place. Otherwise, if you wanted to trade with your neighbors, say to the east or to the west, it'd be very difficult to get to them, as you're having to traverse rocky and hot and unlivable desert regions. They call Egypt the land of the pharaohs and pyramids. There's over 100 pyramids within Egypt. You can see a number of them here as we soar through. This is the Great Pyramid of Giza, of course, and then some other smaller ones here. This is the Nile itself. All the way to the south there, if we kept going, that would be the kingdoms of Kush and Nubia. And then if we switch directions, you can see the Nile flowing out into the Nile Delta and eventually the Mediterranean Sea. That right there is this lighthouse of Alexandria, which we'll get to when we talk about Greece. But you can see this channel of water, known as the Nile, was pretty much what they depended their lives upon. And it talked about if the Nile didn't flood the same, or issues occurred and they didn't have the same harvest, then everything from their way of daily life to trade to even their religious practices would kind of come to a halt, because of the Nile was not doing what they intended and hoped it would do. I hope you guys have enjoyed this tour with me through bits of ancient Egypt. Hopefully we'll get to do a few more of these together, either streamed like we're doing here through YouTube, or maybe in class I'll be able to bring this in and share it with you guys. So take care, guys, and I will return back to the ground and end the recording for today. Make sure to share and subscribe. Just kidding, please don't do that, and I'll see you guys later.